They stood shivering at the front gate, their few belongings tossed into the mud. The guards laughed. "Should have paid your rent, old folks." The couple didn't argue. They just held hands and walked away in silence. But 20 minutes later, 3 black SUVs rolled in, and the guards froze. The man who stepped out wasn't just the new owner. He was their son. Before I dive into this incredible and heartbreaking story, please take a moment and subscribe to our channel so we can bring even more powerful stories like these. The morning sun crept over the edges of the old southern estate, painting the dew-covered grass in a soft gold that made the world look quieter than it really was. Samuel Johnson felt it on his back as he pushed open the greenhouse doors, his bones cracking the way they always did at dawn. 78 years old, slow in the knees, but stubborn in the spirit. He moved with the kind of rhythm that came from doing the same work for over 4 decades. Behind him, Ruth shuffled out with her basket, humming gospel under her breath. Her gray hair pulled back tight, her brown hands weathered from years of soil and sun. She was 76, small and gentle, the kind of woman who whispered blessings into anything she touched. Together, they weren't just caretakers of the estate. They were its heartbeat. They had planted every rose bush. They had mended every fence. They had polished the stables, fed the horses, repaired the shutters, swept the driveways, trimmed the hedges, and kept this land breathing long before the new management was even born. No contracts, no titles, no fancy promises, just loyalty. The kind of loyalty people didn't understand anymore. Samuel always told Ruth, "This land got a memory, baby. It remembers who loves it." And Ruth always smiled back, "Then it'll never forget us." But times were changing, faster than they could keep up with. The old owners, the Montgomery family, had treated Samuel and Ruth with respect. Not perfect, but decent. They'd eaten holiday dinners together sometimes, shared coffee on cold mornings. But when old Mr. Montgomery passed last year, and the estate got turned over to a corporate property group, everything warm vanished. In its place came rules, budgets, and young men in shiny boots who didn't know a rake from a shovel. Now the estate was run by Todd Whitfield, 30 years old, skin pale as printer paper, hair slicked back with cheap gel, and a permanent smirk like he owned the world. He'd only been on the job 3 weeks, but he walked around with a swagger that said he'd never had dirt under his nails a day in his life. To him, Samuel and Ruth were relics, old, slow, unnecessary. He didn't see the heart they poured into the place. He didn't see the history. He saw 2 aging black caretakers whose time, in his opinion, had passed. That morning, though, Samuel didn't know trouble was coming. He thought it'd be like any other day. Feed the horses, clear the fallen branches, check on the irrigation system. Ruth was planning to prune the hydrangeas, maybe bake cornbread for lunch like she always did. Simple things, honest things, the kind of peace that only older folks learn to appreciate. Samuel whistled as he walked toward the stables, his breath fogging in the cool air. The horses neighed softly when they saw him, recognizing his steady voice. "Y'all hungry?" he chuckled, rubbing one of their noses. He felt at home here, even if the world around him was shifting. Ruth gathered magnolia leaves that had blown onto the porch, her steps slow but sure, her eyes soft as she hummed the hymn her mother used to love. She didn't see the black SUV pulling up the long gravel driveway. She didn't see the men climbing out in steel-toe boots and clipboards. She didn't see Todd leading them with that same arrogant strut and a white envelope tucked under his arm. But Samuel heard engines. He stepped out of the stable, narrowing his eyes as the men approached. Todd was walking fast, waving a stack of papers like he was Moses carrying commandments. "Morning, Mr. Whitfield," Samuel said politely, wiping his hands on his overalls. Todd didn't nod back. He didn't slow down. He didn't even pretend to respect the two people who'd spent most of their lives protecting this land. Ruth came up beside her husband, her warm eyes turning cautious. Something felt off. The air felt wrong, thick, heavy, tense. The kind of tension black folks learn to recognize young. Todd finally stopped in front of them, breathing hard, chest puffed out like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Samuel, Ruth," he said shortly. "Good, you're both here." Samuel tipped his head, calm. "Everything all right, son?" Todd grinned the cold kind, the corporate kind. "Actually, no. Everything's changing. This place is under new ownership now, and the company's restructuring." Ruth frowned. "Restructuring what?" Todd pulled out the envelope and slapped it against Samuel's chest. "Your residency, your employment, all of it. As of today, you're terminated." Ruth blinked hard, confused. "Terminated? Todd, baby, we live here." "Not anymore, you don't," he said bluntly. "You've got 24 hours to clear out." There was a silence so sharp, it sliced through the breeze. Samuel stepped back, like the words hit him physically. 24 hours? Son, we ain't got nowhere to go just like that. We've worked this land longer than you've been alive. Just give us till the weekend." Todd scoffed. "Shoulda saved your pennies, old man." One of the younger workers snickered behind him. Another pulled out his phone to record, whispering, "Yo, this gonna be good." Ruth's hand clutched Samuel's arm. Her voice trembled. "Mr. Whitfield, please, we done given this place 40 years. We ain't asking for charity, just time." Todd shrugged. "Time's up, and don't bother arguing. You have no legal claim. You were never owners, never employees on paper, just leftovers from the old regime." Samuel felt something break inside him, the kind of crack that comes from dignity being stepped on. "We ain't leftovers," he said quietly. "We kept this place alive." Todd turned to his crew. "Throw their stuff out, everything. Don't break anything expensive, but get rid of the rest." Samuel's voice shook. "Don't touch my wife's things." Todd smirked. "You want to keep them? Hurry up." The men got to work immediately, dragging furniture out of the small caretaker's cottage. Chairs, quilts, a dresser Samuel built with his own hands. Ruth reached out helplessly as a worker tossed her suitcase into the dirt. Another dumped Samuel's old Bible onto the ground. A few employees laughed. Someone filmed Ruth crying softly, whispering, "Lord, give him peace. He don't know what he's doing." And he didn't. He had no idea who he was humiliating. He had no idea whose life he was tearing apart. He had no idea that the man he was mocking was the father of the estate's real owner. And that truth was coming like thunder. The sky darkened, as if the heavens themselves were ashamed of what was happening on that estate. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, swallowing what little sunlight remained. Ruth tried to gather her scattered things from the dirt, her hands trembling as she picked up her Bible, brushing dust from the worn leather. It had belonged to her grandmother before her, its pages thin as onion skin, corners soft from years of prayer. Seeing it thrown like trash made her heart twist. Samuel bent slowly to lift their overturned suitcase. His back ached, his knees cracked, but he kept moving because pride wouldn't allow him to fall. Not in front of these men, not in front of Todd. But humiliation burned inside him, hot and suffocating, like the sting of a wound he couldn't hide. Todd stood under the porch roof with dry clothes and smug confidence, supervising as if he were directing a construction project rather than an eviction. Rain began to spit from the sky, cold droplets dotting the dirt and soaking into the scattered belongings. The workers didn't care. They laughed, tossed things, pointed at Samuel and Ruth like they were street performers putting on a sad show. One worker kicked over a small wooden box Ruth had kept for years, a box filled with letters and old photographs. Pictures of David as a baby, pictures of birthdays, school events, Christmas mornings where their adopted son grinned with missing teeth. Ruth gasped softly as they spilled across the ground, some blowing in the breeze. Todd snorted. "Why are you keeping all this junk anyway?" Ruth didn't answer. She kneeled down to gather the photographs, shielding them from the rain with her trembling hands. Tears blurred her vision, but she kept going, letting out tiny sobs she tried to swallow. Samuel watched her from the corner of his eye, and something inside him tightened, an emotion so old it felt like memory. He'd lived through enough years to recognize cruelty. And this was cruelty with a smile, the kind that came from men who never had to fear consequences, the kind that tasted like entitlement. "Come on, old man," one worker called mockingly. "Pick it up faster. Rain ain't waiting for you." The others snickered. One filmed again, whispering, "Social media gonna eat this up." Samuel ignored them. He forced his body upright, wiping rain from his face with the back of his hand. "Ruth," he said quietly, "get your shawl. We ain't staying here no more." Ruth looked up at him with watery eyes, clutching her soaked shawl like it was the last piece of dignity she owned. "Where are we gonna go, Samuel?" He swallowed hard. He didn't know. Not yet. But he couldn't let her break. "We gon' figure it out," he said gently. "We always do." Todd clapped sarcastically from the porch. "Great, because your time's almost up. You've got," he glanced at his phone, 19 hours left. Better hurry." One of the workers nudged him. "Man, this is wild." Todd puffed his chest a little. "They should have known better than to think loyalty matters. This is business." Samuel stared at him, not with anger, but with something colder. "Son," he said, voice rough, "business don't excuse heartlessness." Todd raised his eyebrows mockingly. "Heartlessness? This is mercy. You should be thanking me. Most places would toss you out without notice." Ruth let out a soft cry as another worker dropped her sewing basket into a puddle. The threads spilled out, floating like little drowning colors. "Please," she whispered, "not that. Please, don't." The worker kicked it aside. Samuel stepped forward, instinctively protective. "Hey, leave her things alone." The man glared. "Touch me again, and I'll have security throw you out even faster." Samuel's jaw tightened, the lines in his face deepening. This wasn't just disrespect. It was dehumanization. 40 years of loyalty, erased in minutes by a piece of paper and a boy with too much authority. Ruth tugged gently on his sleeve. "Samuel, baby, let it go. The Lord see everything. He know our hearts." He breathed slowly, grounding himself. "I know, Ruth." Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by the roll of thunder. Rain thickened, turning the dirt into mud. Their belongings soaked under the storm as the workers retreated under shelter, leaving Samuel and Ruth to fend for themselves. Todd yelled over the rain, "Don't forget to turn in your keys before you leave. You don't want theft charges added to your problems." Samuel gave a long, tired look at the house. The place he'd repaired through hurricanes, heat waves, fires, and countless seasons. He remembered painting the shutters with his own hands, fixing the roof after a tornado, planting oak trees that now towered overhead. Every corner of that land carried his fingerprints. Now he was being forced off, like he never mattered. He turned to Ruth. "Let's go." They shuffled down the gravel road together, each step heavy and slow. Rain drenched their clothes, plastering them to their thin bodies. Cars drove past without stopping. Some employees even pointed and laughed through their rolled-up windows, seeing the couple as insignificant, powerless, just old caretakers with nothing left. After nearly a mile of walking, Ruth stopped, out of breath. She leaned heavily on Samuel's arm. "My legs, Samuel, they hurt." "I know, baby," he murmured, "just a little farther." But truthfully, he was exhausted too. His knees felt like iron hinges rusted shut. His breath came in short gasps. Still, he kept going, because Ruth needed him to. They reached a small public park, the benches cold and wet. They sat together under a thinning tree, trying to shield themselves from the rain. Samuel wrapped one arm around her shoulders, rubbing her arm gently. Ruth sniffled. "Where are we going to sleep tonight?" Samuel hesitated. We'll find somewhere. Maybe a shelter." She nodded slowly, trusting him because she always had, but fear flickered in her eyes. He squeezed her hand. "We'll be okay." After a long silence, Ruth whispered, "I keep thinking about David." Samuel's heart tightened. Their son, their boy, adopted at age 6, raised with love, taught to be strong. He'd grown into a man they were proud of, a real estate success story, a man who built himself from nothing. He rarely visited anymore, busy with work, but they never held that against him. They figured he was out there living, thriving, becoming someone. "I just hope he's living good," Samuel murmured. Ruth smiled faintly. "He's a good man, just busy. I know he'd help if he knew." Samuel nodded. They didn't know the truth. Not yet. They had no idea their son, the child they raised on this land, the child they'd fed and clothed and prayed over, was the new owner of that very estate. They had no idea that while they shivered on a park bench, he was on his way home. And his arrival would turn the world upside down. The rain didn't let up. It came down in thick, heavy sheets that blurred the edges of the world around Samuel and Ruth as they sat huddled together on that cold park bench. Cars hissed by on the wet road without slowing. People rushed past, holding umbrellas tight, eyes forward, pretending not to see the elderly couple soaked through to the bone. That was the way of the world sometimes. Folks saw pain and stepped around it like it was a puddle they didn't want to get their shoes wet in. Samuel kept rubbing Ruth's shoulder, trying to warm her through the thin fabric of her sweater. His own teeth chattered, despite the brave face he wore. "We'll wait till the rain slows," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring Ruth or himself. Ruth nodded, shivering. "I'm okay, baby. Don't worry about me." But Samuel did worry. Her breathing was uneven. Her fingers felt cold as ice. Decades of hard work had worn their bodies down, and now the storm was finishing the job. He tilted his head back, letting the rain hit his face, and whispered a shaky prayer. "Lord, you see us. You see your children out here. Guide us, please." They sat like that for what felt like hours, two silhouettes lost against the gray curtain of the storm. Eventually, the rain shifted from heavy to steady, just enough for Samuel to make a decision. "Come on now," he said softly. "Let's try and walk a bit. Keep our blood moving. There's a shelter across town. Maybe they'll have room." Ruth tried to stand, but her knees buckled, and Samuel caught her just in time. "It's all right," he whispered, holding her firmly. Lean on me." They walked slowly through puddles, shoes soaked through, clothes weighing them down. Every step felt heavier than the last. But Samuel didn't let go, not once. He whispered encouragement with each step, the way Ruth used to whisper to him after he came home from long days on the estate. "You remember when David used to run through them fields?" Ruth asked faintly, trying to distract herself from the cold. Samuel chuckled softly despite everything. "Lord, that boy was fast. Used to scare them horses something awful." He paused, memories warming him more than the thin air. "You remember when he got stuck up the old oak tree? Said he was looking for angels." Ruth smiled through her exhaustion. "He always had big dreams." "He still do," Samuel said. "I can feel it." But even as he said it, a sadness tugged at him. They hadn't seen their son in almost 4 years. He was always traveling, always working, first in Chicago, then Miami, then overseas handling real estate contracts. He called every Christmas, every birthday, sometimes on Sundays just to check in. But he wasn't here. He didn't know the choice they'd made to stay on the estate after the new company took over. They never wanted to be a burden. "We should have told him," Ruth whispered suddenly, as if reading Samuel's thoughts. "We should have told him we needed help." Samuel sighed. "He's busy living his life, Ruth. We raised him to go after his dreams. Didn't want him worrying about us." Ruth nodded, but her eyes clouded. "Still, sometimes I wish he knew." Samuel opened his mouth to respond, then froze. Ruth staggered slightly, pressing her hand to her chest. "Sam, I'm tired. Just a little more," he said quickly, swallowing panic. "We almost there. Lean on me, baby." But Ruth shook her head weakly. "Sam, I don't think I can." He held her tighter. "Yes, you can. I ain't leaving you behind. Not now, not never." Ruth managed a soft smile. "I know. You always been my strength." They kept moving, inch by inch, step by slow step. Every few minutes, Samuel glanced around, hoping for a miracle. A bus, a taxi, anything. But the roads were empty except for fast-moving cars that splashed water onto the sidewalk as they passed. Finally, they reached a closed grocery store with a small awning. Samuel guided Ruth to sit beneath it, shielding her as best he could. "Rest a minute," he said, brushing wet hair from her forehead. Ruth's breathing was thin and shaky, but she squeezed his hand. "We gon' be okay," she whispered softly. "God see us." Samuel nodded, though fear knotted in his stomach. The storm, the cold, the long walk, it was too much for her. He pressed his forehead to her temple, whispering, "Lord, please don't let her suffer." As he held her hand beneath the flickering store sign, Samuel's eyes drifted upward to the dark sky. He wondered if David ever thought about them, wondered if his son knew how proud they were, wondered if the boy they raised felt the tug in his heart that told him his parents needed him. Ruth whispered, "You think David's happy?" "I hope so," Samuel murmured. "He deserves joy. We always wanted that for him." Ruth nodded. "He's a good man, just busy." Samuel smiled sadly. "Yeah, good man, busy man." They didn't know that miles away, at that very moment, David Johnson had just landed in the nearest airport, exhausted from a business trip, ready to inspect the newest addition to his real estate portfolio. The estate, the land his parents had cared for their entire lives. He had no idea Todd existed. He had no idea anyone had been evicted. He had no idea his parents were homeless, sitting outside a grocery store in the rain. He only knew this: he had bought the estate because something in his heart pulled him back home. Something told him the place needed him, Something told him it was time to return. Back at the grocery store, Samuel wrapped his arms around Ruth, warming her the best he could. "We gonna be all right," he whispered again, more to keep himself calm than anything. "Just a little longer." Ruth closed her eyes. "You always protect me, Samuel. And I always will," he whispered fiercely. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the street. In the distance, a familiar car engine echoed faintly through the storm. Samuel didn't notice. Ruth didn't either. But fate was already shifting. Their son was on his way home. And he was about to discover the truth. David Johnson stepped out of the airport into the damp Georgia night, the smell of wet asphalt curling through the air. His driver hurried forward with an umbrella, but David waved it away, letting the mist settle across his tailored coat. After weeks of business meetings overseas, this place, this small southern town, felt like another world, a quieter world, a world he'd left behind long ago. He climbed into the sleek black SUV, loosening his tie as the engine hummed to life. His assistant sat beside him, flipping through documents. "Sir, the estate inspection is tomorrow morning. I've arranged for the staff to be present." David nodded absently, staring out the window. "Good. I want everything in order. That property used to be the pride of this whole region. It deserves better than what it's become." His assistant raised an eyebrow. "Sir, no offense, but most people just tear down these old estates." David's gaze hardened a little. "My parents raised me on that land. I know the value of it." The assistant blinked. "Your parents worked there?" David nodded once. "Caretakers, for 40 years. The assistant swallowed. "Then I'll make sure things are perfect." David didn't respond. His mind drifted back to memories he rarely visited. Samuel lifting him onto a horse for the first time. Ruth cheering when he chased fireflies in the yard. The warm smell of her peach cobbler in the kitchen on Sundays. He hadn't been back since they moved away. Life got busy. Work got bigger. Calls became shorter, farther apart. He felt a twist of guilt thinking about it. The SUV rolled down the winding road toward the estate. The trees on either side bowed under the weight of the rainfall, draping shadows over the long drive. As they neared the gate, headlights caught on piles of broken furniture scattered near the entrance. David sat forward sharply. "Stop the car." The driver braked immediately. David stepped out into the drizzle, walking toward the mess. A chair leg snapped under his shoe. A cracked lamp lay in the mud. A suitcase, faded blue, split open, spilling old robes and shirts into a puddle. He bent down and lifted one of the shirts, recognition punching him hard in the chest. He brought the fabric to his nose. Lavender detergent. The same kind Ruth always used. His fingertips trembled. His chest sank as a sickening realization dawned. These weren't random items. These weren't trash. These were his parents' things. "What happened here?" David demanded sharply. One of the guards lounging near the gate shrugged lazily. "Old caretakers. We tossed him out this morning." David froze. His whole body went still, like the world had stopped moving. The guard kept talking, unaware of the storm he was walking straight into. "Couple freeloaders, you know? Acted like they owned the place. Supervisor said to get rid of them. They was making a scene." David's voice came out quiet. "Dangerous." "What? Were their names?" The guard snorted. "I don't know. Samuel maybe. And the lady was Ruth or something. Ain't important." The car door flew open as David stepped forward, his expression transforming into something fierce, something sharp. His assistant called after him, but David didn't hear. All he could see was the blue suitcase, the broken lamp, the rain-soaked clothes that should have been hanging neatly in his parents' bedroom. His parents had been here today. They had lived here, and this man had thrown them into the mud like animals. David's jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. "Where are they?" he asked flatly. The guard shrugged again, a gesture so disrespectful David felt heat flood his chest. "How should I know? Probably homeless by now." David's hands curled into fists. The assistant hurried over, whispering urgently, "Sir, maybe we should—" But David had already turned toward the estate office, walking with long, furious strides. The rain hit harder now, lashing against him, soaking through the wool of his coat, but he didn't slow, didn't stop, didn't think. Inside the estate office, workers milled about, laughing, sipping coffee, scrolling on their phones. Todd sat at the front desk, feet propped up, bragging loudly to a coworker about putting those old freeloaders in their place. David pushed the door open so hard, it slammed against the wall. Everyone jumped. Todd looked up, annoyed. This building's closed to outside visitors. You can come back tomorrow." David slapped a sheet of paper onto the counter so hard it echoed. The deed, the signature, the owner's seal. Todd squinted. "What's this supposed to—" "You threw out the only people who kept this land alive," David said, voice shaking not with fear, but with fury. "Those freeloaders you mocked? Those old folks you humiliated?" He leaned forward, eyes burning into Todd's. "They were my parents." You could hear a pin drop. Todd's jaw went slack. His face drained of color. The workers behind him stilled completely, eyes wide, breaths held. David didn't stop. For 40 years, they took care of this estate. They watered your gardens, fed your animals, cleaned your grounds. They kept this place standing while people like you watched from the sidelines. His voice cracked, raw and furious. And you threw them into the dirt. Todd stammered. I didn't know. That's the problem, David cut in sharply. People like you never know. You never bother to learn. You never ask. You just judge. The assistant stepped forward quietly. Sir, do you want me to call security? David shook his head slowly, never breaking eye contact with Todd. No. His voice dropped to a cold whisper. I am security. Then he said 3 words that ended Todd's career. You're fired, immediately. Todd let out a broken sound, disbelief spilling across his face. Sir, wait! Get out, David said. All of you who helped him, get out, tonight. Workers scattered like frightened birds, grabbing their belongings, avoiding David's gaze. Todd stumbled toward the exit, drenched in humiliation, no understanding of how far his mistake had just cost him. David stood alone in the office, the sound of the rain pounding the windows like angry hands. He closed his eyes, inhaled a shaky breath, and whispered to himself. Where are you, Mom? Dad? He grabbed the car keys and stormed back into the rain. He wouldn't stop until he found them, wouldn't sleep, wouldn't breathe, not until he brought them home. And somewhere across town, under a trembling street lamp, Samuel and Ruth huddled together, unaware that their son was searching for them in the darkness, driven by a fire unlike anything he'd ever felt. Night settled heavy across the small southern town, the rain finally dialing back to a soft drizzle that clung to everything it touched. Neon signs flickered across half-empty streets, and puddles mirrored the streetlights like scattered pools of broken gold. David's SUV tore through the quiet roads, windshield wipers beating in frantic rhythm as he scanned every sidewalk, every bus stop, every storefront. His heart had never beaten this hard. Not when he closed his first $1 million deal. Not when he opened his first international office. not even when he received awards and applause from rooms full of people with perfect smiles and perfect suits. This was different. He wasn't a CEO tonight. He wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't even the owner of the estate. He was just a son, trying to find his parents. Samuel and Ruth hadn't answered their phone in months, but he assumed they were busy, or sleeping early, or simply content with their quiet life. Now he knew better. Now he knew he hadn't called enough, hadn't visited enough, hadn't paid attention enough. His assistant whispered from the back seat, "Sir, it's late. Maybe we should call local shelters." "No," David said sharply, eyes glued to the road. "They're out here. I can feel it." The driver slowed at an intersection. David leaned forward, scanning the sidewalks. Then he froze. Under the flickering light of a grocery store sign sat two elderly figures. A man hunched forward, arms wrapped around a frail woman. A broken umbrella leaned uselessly beside them. Their clothes were soaked, their faces drawn, their hands intertwined as if holding each other upright. David's breath left his lungs. "Dad? Mom? Stop the car!" he shouted. The SUV screeched to a halt. David jumped out before the door fully opened, splashing into a puddle as he ran toward them. His voice cracked, raw and terrified. "Mom! Dad!" Samuel blinked slowly, lifting his head. Ruth stirred against his shoulder. Their eyes squinted through the mist. At first, they didn't recognize him. Not because they didn't know their son, but because they couldn't imagine he would be standing there, rain-soaked, shaking, desperate, calling out to them. David kneeled in front of them, his expensive coat sinking into the mud. "Mom, Dad, it's me. It's David." Ruth's hand lifted weakly, fingers trembling as they brushed the side of his face. She whispered, voice thin as air, "David, baby." He took her hand and pressed it to his tear-streaked cheek. "I'm here. I'm here now." Samuel straightened slowly, pushing through the stiffness in his spine, letting out a breath that sounded like a lifetime of pain finally releasing. "Son, is that really you?" David turned to him and broke. He leaned forward, wrapping both arms around his father, holding him tightly, fiercely, as if he feared letting go would make them disappear again. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. I didn't know what they did to you." Samuel closed his eyes, his weathered hands lifting with effort to hold his son's back. "We didn't want you worrying," he murmured. "Didn't want to trouble you." David pulled back just enough to meet his father's eyes. "You are never a burden. Never." Ruth leaned into them both, tears mixing with rain. We thought you were off living your big life." David kissed her forehead. "My life means nothing if my family is suffering." Cars passed slowly, drivers staring at the emotional reunion unfolding under the dim streetlight. The grocery store sign flickered again, humming softly like the world was holding its breath. David scooped his mother into his arms as gently as he could. "Come on, let's get you out of this cold." His assistant rushed to open the car doors and grab blankets. Samuel tried to stand on his own, but his legs shook. David turned, offering his arm. "Lean on me, Dad." For the first time in years, Samuel did. Inside the warm SUV, Ruth curled into the heated seat, shivering until David wrapped her in a thick blanket. Samuel lowered himself beside her, staring at the luxury around him with a mix of awe and disbelief. He whispered, "I ain't ridden in a car this nice in my whole life." David sat between them, holding both their hands as the SUV pulled away from the curb. "You'll ride in nicer," he promised softly. "I'll make sure of it." Ruth's lips quivered. We We lost the cottage. They threw us out like trash. David's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice gentle. You didn't lose anything. They stole from you, and I'm taking it back. Samuel shook his head. Son, we didn't tell you because we didn't want you thinking we needed your money. David looked at the man who had raised him, fed him, taught him what integrity meant. You gave me everything, he whispered. You worked until your bones hurt, so I could get an education. You starved yourself sometimes just so I could eat. You think I wouldn't help you? You think I wouldn't fight for you? Samuel swallowed hard. We didn't want to be a burden, David. You're my parents, David said, voice thick with emotion. My foundation, my heart. There is no world where you're a burden. Ruth reached up, cupping his cheek with her cold hand. We're just glad you found us, she whispered. I prayed tonight for a sign. Didn't think God would send my own son. David kissed her knuckles. He sent me the moment you needed me. The SUV turned down the long estate road. Samuel and Ruth exchanged confused glances. David took a deep breath. I need to tell you something. Samuel raised an eyebrow. What's that, son? David squeezed their hands. This estate, the one you worked on for 40 years, the one they threw you out of. He paused, letting the truth settle in the air like a slow sunrise. I bought it. Ruth gasped. Samuel stared, stunned. You what? David nodded. I'm the new owner. I came to restore it, not knowing you were still here. His voice darkened, not knowing they were mistreating you. Ruth covered her mouth, tears spilling again. Oh, Lord. Samuel leaned back in his seat, shock washing over him. After all these years, our boy bought the lands we gave our life to? David smiled softly. Not just the land, the legacy. The SUV rolled to a stop before the estate gates. Workers who had mocked Samuel and Ruth earlier watched in disbelief as David stepped out first, opening the back doors himself. He held out a hand. Let's go home. Samuel stepped out slowly, staring at the massive property he once tended like a living thing. Ruth followed, leaning on David, as the three of them walked through the gates together. The same men who had laughed at them now stood frozen, faces draining of color. One of them whispered, "Oh my God, they're his parents." David didn't even look their way. He kept his focus on the two people whose love had shaped his life. This land belongs to you, he told them softly. I just hold the paperwork. Ruth's hand tightened around his arm. David, baby, we don't deserve. You deserve everything, he said firmly. Everything they stole, everything life denied you. Samuel's eyes glistened. We ain't never had nothing like this. You have it now. The workers lowered their eyes. Nobody laughed this time. Not a sound dared disturb the moment as David guided his parents through the estate they had been thrown out of, now returning not as caretakers, but as family, as royalty of their own story. And justice had finally come home. The storm had eased, but the world still felt soaked in the night's grief as David led his parents into the mansion's courtyard. Rain dripped from the gutters in slow, rhythmic taps, and the distant flicker of lightning illuminated the estate like a faded memory trying to come back to life. Samuel stood under the porch awning, staring at the place he had tended for 4 decades. His hands shook, not from cold, but from disbelief. Ruth beside him wiped her tears with the corner of her sleeve, her voice barely a breath. I never thought I'd walk through these doors again. David squeezed her hand. You're walking through the front door this time, Mom, not the workers' entrance. That sentence alone made Ruth's shoulders tremble. Inside the foyer, the staff who remained stood awkwardly, trying to disappear into the walls. Nobody dared speak, not after the owner had returned with the very couple they had mocked. One of the younger maids whispered to her coworker, "I can't believe they're his parents." Another replied, "We really messed up." David ignored them entirely. He wasn't here to entertain guilt from people who had shown none earlier. He guided his parents into the living room, where the warm glow of the chandelier dusted the room in soft gold. Ruth sank into the plush sofa, her first real seat in hours. Samuel sat beside her slowly, staring down at the blankets wrapped around their legs, as if unsure this was real. David pulled up a chair in front of them. "Tell me everything." Ruth's lip quivered. "It started when the new supervisor came," she whispered. "That man, Todd, he treated us like we were in the way, like we were dirt on his boots." Samuel nodded, voice heavy with exhaustion. "We tried to keep our heads down, didn't want to cause no trouble. We just wanted to work." "Work?" David said sharply. "You built this place. You kept it alive." Samuel stared at the tiled floor. Didn't matter to him. He said we were too old, too slow. Called us liabilities. Ruth clenched the blanket tighter. He said the new owners didn't want old folks taking up space. David's jaw tightened. "I am the new owner, and I never said that." Samuel looked at him sadly. "We didn't know, son. We didn't know you bought the estate. They never told us." A wave of guilt crashed over David. His success had taken him so far away from home that even the biggest decision of his business life had missed the people it mattered to most. Samuel continued, "The day he fired us, he didn't even let us pack proper. Just threw our things into the dirt. Folks were laughing." Ruth's eyes filled again. "I kept asking for just one more night, one more hour, but he said," her voice cracked, "he said we ain't earned nothing." David's fingers dug into the armrest. "You earned everything." Ruth nodded weakly, but he didn't see it. David took a long breath, steadying the fury boiling in his chest. He reached out and took both their hands in his. "You are never working another day in your life unless you choose to. You will live here, comfortable and respected, and you will never be touched by people like him again." Ruth covered her mouth, tears rolling silently. Samuel's chin trembled. "We don't want to be no burden, son." David shook his head. "Stop saying that. You raised me. You loved me when nobody else did. I owe you everything." Ruth leaned forward, touching his cheek gently. "You owe us nothing, baby, but we're grateful." David smiled softly, though the edges carried pain. "Well, you're getting everything anyway." He stood suddenly and signaled toward the doorway. His assistant entered with a stack of folders. David took them and handed one to Samuel. "What's this?" Samuel asked, confused. "Property paperwork," David said. "This cottage right behind the estate, it's yours. I renovated it last year. Didn't know you were the ones living in the old caretaker's quarters, or I would have given it to you immediately." Samuel blinked hard, opening the folder with shaking hands. "Son, this house must be worth—" David gently cut him off. "Worth giving to the people who deserve it." Ruth looked stunned. We never had a home that was ours." "You do now," David said. Before his parents could respond, a sudden knock echoed through the hall. 3 quick raps, nervous and urgent. One of the remaining staff members peeked in. "Sir, Todd is at the gate. He says he needs to talk to you." David felt a cold calm wash over him. "Let him in." The maid hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Let him in," Minutes later, Todd approached the living room with water dripping from his hair, clothes sticking to his skin, and panic all over his face. He stepped inside like a man walking into a courtroom. David didn't stand. Todd cleared his throat. "Sir, I just came to explain." "No," David said quietly. "You came to apologize." Todd swallowed. "Yes, sir. I didn't know they were your parents." Samuel stiffened. David slowly stood up. "And if they weren't my parents, would that make what you did okay?" Todd froze. David stepped closer, voice dropping to a razor whisper. "You threw out two elderly people in the rain. You mocked them, humiliated them. You laughed while they begged you for time." Todd's mouth opened, but no words came. "You treated them like animals," David continued. "All because you thought nobody important was watching." Todd ran a shaky hand through his wet hair. I made a mistake." "No," David said, eyes burning through him. "You revealed who you are." Todd took a trembling step back. David didn't yell, didn't raise a hand, didn't even move aggressively. He didn't need to. His presence did the work for him. "I fire you," David said coldly. "And that decision stands. You will not step foot on this property again." Todd lowered his gaze, shame breaking whatever arrogance had remained. He stumbled backward toward the hallway, disappearing into the rain. David returned to his parents, whose eyes watched him with a mix of pride and sadness. Samuel whispered, "You didn't have to do all that for us." David kneeled between them again. "I wasn't doing it for you," he said softly. "I was doing it for the boy you raised, for the man you shaped. I am the way I am because of you." Ruth touched his cheek again. "We always knew you'd grow up strong." David pressed his forehead to her shoulder, letting the last of his anger melt. "I just wish I'd come sooner." "We're here now," Ruth whispered. "That's what matters." Samuel nodded. "We're family. That's all that counts." Outside, the storm finally lifted. Inside, something even stronger settled. Peace. For the first time in years, the Johnson family wasn't carrying anything alone. The world had pushed them out, thrown them away, mocked their age and loyalty. But their son had come back. And this time, they weren't the caretakers. They were the ones being cared for. Morning sunlight spilled across the estate like a promise, golden and warm, washing away the last traces of the storm that had battered the land overnight. The driveway, still glistening with moisture, looked almost polished as the first of several black SUVs rolled up the hill. Workers, who had shown up early hoping to make sense of the chaos from the night before, stopped what they were doing and stared, whispering among themselves as the powerful vehicles lined up one by one. David stepped out of the mansion's front door with a confidence that felt different today. Calmer, rooted, purpose-driven. This wasn't the swagger of a billionaire CEO. It was the gravity of a son who finally understood the weight of his parents' sacrifices. Behind him, Samuel and Ruth walked slowly but proudly toward the driveway. The old couple, who had been tossed out like garbage not even 24 hours earlier, now moved through the estate like royalty, returning to claim what was rightfully theirs. Ruth wore a soft cream sweater, her hair pinned neatly, her shoulders no longer curled inward. Samuel had on a clean button-up shirt David had given him that morning. And though he walked with a slight limp, he moved with dignity in every step. The workers watched in stunned silence as the trio approached. Some lowered their eyes, unable to face the people they had mocked and evicted. Others stood frozen, with their guilt exposed under the morning sun. The same groundsmen who had thrown their furniture into the dirt now shuffled back, whispering nervously to each other. David's security team exited the SUVs and lined the entrance in quiet formation, not as intimidation, but as protection. Today wasn't about fear. It was about respect. A single worker, the one who had recorded the eviction on his phone, glanced at Samuel and Ruth, the shame so heavy on his shoulders it looked like he had aged overnight. His hands trembled as he turned off the mower. He'd been pretending to work. David stopped, just a few feet from the cluster of employees. His voice was calm but carried like thunder across the open courtyard. Some of you laughed yesterday. No one moved. Some of you stood by and watched two elderly people thrown out of their home. His eyes locked on the worker with the phone. Some of you recorded it like entertainment. A murmur rippled through the staff. The worker looked down at his shoes, face red. David continued, "But you forgot something." He stepped aside, revealing Samuel and Ruth standing behind him. Together, steady, unbroken. You forgot that respect isn't about title. It's about humanity. Heads bowed instantly. Nobody dared speak. Samuel stepped forward slowly. The workers stiffened, unsure if he would yell or cry or lecture. Instead, he simply cleared his throat and spoke in the gentle voice he had used his whole life. "We ain't here for revenge," he said softly. "We never been that kind." His voice wavered but held. "But the way you treated us, it hurt. Not because we expected special treatment, but because we expected decency." Ruth squeezed his arm, adding quietly, "Kindness don't cost nothing, sugar." One of the maids wiped a tear from her cheek. David stepped between his parents again. "I am the legal owner of this estate," he said firmly. "But they are the heart of it." Several workers nodded silently, shame tightening their throats. "So here's what's happening." David turned to Samuel, placing a hand on his father's back. "My parents will not be working here anymore." A few workers sighed in relief, glad the old couple wouldn't be forced back into labor. Then David raised his voice. "They'll be living here, as owners." Gasps cut through the air. One worker dropped the broom he was holding. Another man pressed a hand over his mouth. "But," someone stammered. "Sir, the deed." "The cottage behind the gardens," David said. "Signed over to them this morning." Samuel's mouth opened as if to speak, but emotion strangled the words before they escaped. Ruth's eyes filled with tears again. "And as for the staff," David continued, "everyone who mocked them, laughed at them, disrespected them, will undergo review. Some of you might be dismissed. Some of you might stay under strict supervision. But what won't happen, ever again, is an old couple being thrown out like trash." A deep silence settled, heavy but cleansing, like a storm washing away what didn't belong. David turned to the man who had recorded the eviction. "You filmed them suffering," he said. "Did you ever film their kindness, their loyalty, their 40 years of service?" The man shook his head, tears welling. "That's what I thought." David walked back toward his parents. "But I'll tell you something," he said, turning one last time toward the staff. "My parents aren't little people. They aren't weak. They aren't just caretakers." He stepped aside again, letting the full weight of the moment settle. They are the reason this land still stands. Ruth reached over and touched Samuel's hand, whispering something only he could hear. He nodded softly, smiling through the tears that glimmered at the corner of his eyes. David placed the master keys, heavy, old-fashioned, symbolic, into Samuel's palm. Gasps again, a few claps, then more. Soon the entire courtyard echoed with applause. Not the polite, empty kind, but the deep, Emotional recognition of two lives finally honored. Ruth cried openly, pressing her hand against her mouth. Samuel stood taller than he had in years. David leaned in and whispered, "This place belongs to you now. You just let me handle the paperwork." For the first time since yesterday's hell, Samuel's laughter broke through. Soft at first, then warm. Ruth joined him, crying and laughing at the same time. The same gate that had closed heartlessly on them now opened itself as if bowing in apology. And for the first time in their lives, Samuel and Ruth Johnson weren't just walking onto the land they maintained. They were walking home. Weeks slipped by gently, the way time moves when life finally stops hurting. The estate that once felt cold and cruel now carried a new kind of warmth, soft, easy, familiar. Samuel and Ruth settled into their cottage at the back of the gardens, the same cottage they had scrubbed and repaired for years. Only now, the keys were theirs, the title was theirs, and the land seemed to breathe differently under their footsteps. Ruth planted roses outside the front porch, carefully pressing each root into the soil like she was tucking in an old friend. Pink ones, red ones, soft yellows that glowed like honey in the afternoon sun. Every bloom felt like a small victory, a reminder that beauty could grow even where cruelty once tried to take root. Samuel rebuilt the wooden fence near the horse stables, not because he had to, but because he said his hands got lonely if they ain't fixing something. David visited every couple of days, no longer arriving in suits or with assistants trailing behind. He came in jeans and boots, bringing groceries he insisted they didn't need, or new tools he claimed he just found on sale. Each time, Samuel pretended to protest, but smiled wide as he carried the bags inside. Neighbors and former employees stopped by too, some with guilt still heavy in their eyes, some with casseroles, some with tears. The ones who had mocked them avoided their gaze at first, but Samuel always greeted them with the same gentle nod, and Ruth always said, "Baby, forgiveness is free. Go on now." Word had spread in town that the Johnsons weren't just caretakers anymore. They were the soul of the estate. The story of their eviction, their long walk in the storm, their son's return, it all traveled far. Some folks whispered it like a miracle, others like a warning. A few even said the land somehow looked brighter now, as if it knew it had been reclaimed by the rightful hands. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the sky melted into shades of gold and lavender, Samuel sat on the porch swing, moving slowly back and forth. His joints ached in the evening air, but he didn't mind. Ruth stepped out with 2 mugs of warm tea and handed him one, her fingers brushing his, just long enough to say everything without words. David arrived minutes later, walking down the path with a soft grin. "Evening, Mom, Dad." Ruth smiled. "Evening, baby. You hungry? I made peach cobbler." "I'm always hungry for your peach cobbler," he said, laughing as he joined them on the porch. They talked about little things, flowers blooming early, the horses acting stubborn again, a friend who had stopped by to apologize for staying silent during the eviction. But eventually, the conversation dipped into that thoughtful silence only families share, the kind filled with unspoken understanding. David looked at his parents, a softness settling in his chest. "I used to think success meant leaving this place behind," he said quietly. "But I realize now, the real success was coming back." Ruth reached out and squeezed his hand. "You came back right on time, baby." Samuel took a slow sip of his tea. "Funny thing is," he added, "we didn't raise you to be rich. We raised you to be righteous. Looks like you learned both." They all laughed, a light, warm sound that drifted across the yard and danced through the rose bushes. As the sun dipped behind the tree line, fireflies began to glow, blinking like tiny lanterns. The cottage lights flickered on, casting a golden halo over the porch. Everything felt still, peaceful, restored. David walked toward the front gate before leaving that night. He stopped for a moment, looking at the tall iron bars that once shut his parents out. Now the gate stood open, wide and welcoming. Wind rustled the leaves above him as if whispering secrets the land had kept too long. He whispered back, almost to himself, "Nobody shuts them out again. Not ever." The gate creaked lightly in the breeze, almost like it agreed. Back at the cottage, Ruth stood in the doorway, watching him, her silhouette framed by soft kitchen light. She placed a hand over her heart, grateful beyond words. Samuel rested on the porch swing, humming an old gospel tune, his eyes following David until he disappeared down the drive. The world felt right again. Later that night, as the couple settled into bed, Ruth whispered into the quiet room, "Samuel, can you believe all this? Us, owners of this land?" Samuel chuckled, slow and deep. "Baby, the truth is, we always owned it. We just didn't have the papers." Ruth smiled in the dark. "God don't sleep, does he?" "Not even for a second," Samuel replied. Samuel said. They drifted off to sleep with peace resting on their chests, like a warm blanket. The next morning, sunlight poured through their windows, painting soft stripes across the floor. Ruth stepped outside to water her roses, and Samuel followed behind with his tool belt, ready to fix whatever needed fixing. Life wasn't perfect. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. And every inch of that land, the gardens they grew, the fences they repaired, the stables they tended, now stood as a monument to quiet strength, to dignity, to the truth that the world keeps trying to forget. Kindness costs nothing, but cruelty can cost everything. The screen would fade gently, the final image settling on the open estate gate, sunlight spilling across the path like a blessing. Then the last words appear slowly. Respect is not a gift, it is a right. Kindness costs nothing, but cruelty can cost everything. And the story ends where it began, on the land they always loved, finally loving them back.